The Guardian.
This is Politics Weekly. I'm Jonathan Friedland. And what a febrile week it's been. And it's not over yet. A new Brexit offer from Theresa May, or is it so new? A cabinet resignation, elections, and what seems to be the imminent departure of the Prime Minister. We'll talk about it all. Also this week, it was announced on Wednesday that British Steel has entered insolvency after the company's emergency funding talks with the government collapsed. British Steel's demise is considered a result of ongoing Brexit uncertainty, and with thousands of jobs now at risk, the timing really couldn't have been worse for a government already lagging behind in the polls just as voting got underway for the European elections. So, the Brexit withdrawal agreement, British Steel and the European elections, and the ongoing crisis about Theresa May and her leadership, it's all coming up in this week's Politics Weekly. As we record, Theresa May is still in Downing Street with the sofa pressed against the door, in the memorable words of Ian Duncan Smith. For a while, on Wednesday, it looked as if it might not be that way. That day ended with the resignation of the Leader of the House, Andrea Leadsom, and all afternoon, Westminster was in the grip of rumours that May herself was about to go. The trigger for all this was her final attempt at passing her beloved withdrawal agreement, at perhaps the fourth time of asking, which, to quote The Guardian's own John Crace, managed to have nothing for everyone, which was his line on it. To discuss all of that, we are joined by Henry Newman from Open Europe, Guardian columnist Zoe Williams, and the Daily Mirror's political editor, Pippa Crerar. Hello to all of you. Pippa, just fill us in. What exactly was it about this new deal from Theresa May that managed to annoy everybody?
So we were summoned on Tuesday to PwC's headquarters in Charing Cross for a great prime ministerial speech. And we were told we were to expect to set out her bold new Brexit vision, which obviously we'd been talking about in the days prior to that. I don't think anybody had particularly high expectations, knowing how Number 10 works and having heard what some of the things that the Prime Minister has promised before. But there she was. She gave her speech, interestingly, about bringing MPs together to support her bill, not in Parliament, which from the off angered quite a lot of MPs. They thought they should have been the ones to hear first. And then she set out what her 10-point plan for how the bill was going to be different and how it actually could be got through. Now, the two key areas which proved the most controversial were her promise to give MPs the chance to vote on whether we want to have a second referendum, and crucially to legislate for it if they decided that they did want one. And then the other aspect was this really controversial customs union aspect, which the Conservative Party, the bulk of the Conservative Party, are really against. And her suggestion that MPs would also get a say on which customs union option there might be. So immediately after the speech, Tory MPs were first out the traps. Labour MPs followed very quickly, criticising it. And it was apparent by the time we'd walked back the 5 minutes down the road to Westminster that it wasn't a flyer, that it was really too much, that too many people opposed to. John put it brilliantly when he said that there was nothing for everyone. I think her intention was to have something for everyone, to sort of take the best bits from the talks with Labour and the best bits to try and appease the Tory Brexiteers with alternative arrangements on the border and put them all together in some sort of mishmash that there might actually be enough there just to get everyone over the line, but it had the opposite effect.
So, Zoe, for you as somebody who's Remain-minded, would probably like there to be a referendum. Why was her promise there, Theresa May's promise there, to have a bill or a vote on a second referendum? Why did that not please Remainers and People's Voters?
Well, I think if the Labour Party were coherently and cohesively Remain at this point, they would be at the point now where they'd say, just get any deal so we can amend it to get a confirmatory vote on it. But I feel like they're utilising the response of the Tories in order to maintain their ambiguous position. So they can then say, no, this is a terrible deal. We can't possibly vote through this deal. So they don't have to actually put it on the table and say we're having a confirmatory ballot. But, it's absolute tightrope stuff at this stage because Jeremy Corbyn does seem to be coming round to a confirmatory vote. And he's just not yet ready, it seems, to get the deal on the table.
But just on that, what Zoe was saying about any deal, but then attaching a vote, in a way, Pippa wasn't, to Theresa May, giving them that chance?
I'm not sure, though, that at this point they would have backed anything. I mean, I think she could have offered them the earth and they wouldn't have backed up anything. Ultimately, they've decided that the chaos and confusion that would ensue from the deal falling, potentially you're going to end up with a second referendum or general election anyway. I mean, the Prime Minister herself warned that. And they want really, I think they recognise that the numbers still aren't there in Parliament for a second referendum. And the best chance of it happening is for it to happen at the very final moment when the choice is, for example, no deal versus a referendum. Well, I mean...
So Henry, just let's hear from Henry, because he hasn't come in yet. Just on this thing about why Conservatives who have said they want a deal and want Brexit, here was their chance. Why was it not good enough for them?
Look, I think basically the overall problem we got is that the Prime Minister is a messenger, and whatever message that she's giving, she's not somebody that they want or anyone really wants to hear from at this stage. There's a sense, even before the speech, that the tide was going out on her time in Downing Street. Back in 2017, at the time of the last general election, George Osborne described her as a dead woman walking. For me, the miracle is that she's kept walking for basically 2 years since then. But her reverse Midas touch when it comes to politics came into effect again with this speech, and it managed to absolutely alienate every single constituency. Now, I think that's quite unfair, because if you look at the substance of the detail, I disagree with John Grace's analysis that there was nothing for everyone. I think it was actually pretty much as whatever, if you look at what she could reasonably have actually offered to different blocks of MPs asking for different things, I think she pretty much gave it to all of them. The tone might not have been exactly right. And I think what particularly angered Conservatives was the sense that not only would there be a vote on a referendum, which of course any bill you put to Parliament could always be amended to include a second referendum, a customs union, whatever else. It was the sense that she would even stoop to leading a government to a second referendum. And she should have perhaps expressed that differently. But I don't really think that was the point. I think everyone had just given up on the Prime Minister. So she could have gone, as Pippa was saying, and promised the earth, and everyone would have just said, no, thank you.
I think that point is really interesting. You have to, she had to give something to each constituency. The problem is there is no compromise between the constituencies. So anything she gives to one is read as a insult to another. So she's in a complete zero-sum game. I don't know what they expect her to do.
Is it possible that eventually whoever takes over from her will come back with something that looks a lot like this, and suddenly everyone will go, oh, well, that's statesman-like, visionary, extraordinary accommodation, wisdom of Solomon that they've done?
I think they might have to. I mean, I don't think that would be necessarily be their intention in the first instance. I mean, Boris Johnson, for example, the front runner in the Tory leadership contest as things stand, has this grand plan to go back to Brussels and feels that he knows Brussels. He was brought up there. He spent time as a Brussels correspondent. He knows it inside out. And as far as he's concerned, he would have a better chance at getting something out of the Europeans. Now, we'll have to wait and see whether that happens. But ultimately, I suspect that the European Union will give him the same answer that they've been giving Theresa May for the last couple of years. And he'll have to come back and try and recast what is already there. I mean, there are bits of the deal which he's quite happy with, the withdrawal deal, and try and recast what's there and just sell it differently.
I think one of the interesting things is actually this speech wasn't really aimed at Conservatives, because if you look at the kind of numbers from the last parliamentary vote on Brexit, only 34 Conservative MPs opposed the deal. There was a sort of recognition in Downing Street particularly that they weren't going to persuade enough of those last 34 MPs to switch to backing the deal, and therefore they needed to reach more broadly. That was the whole purpose of the talks with Labour, and those talks ended up basically collapsing because Keir Starmer wanted to implode them despite the best efforts, I think, of the Shadow Chancellor, who's very keen on a deal in particular. But when I spoke to a very senior figure in Downing Street just before the speech, the message was very clear that Downing Street was basically putting itself entirely in Labour's hands. And of course, you can say, well, that's ridiculous. The opposition party has absolutely no incentive to help the government. And that's pretty much exactly what seems to be where we've ended up. But what they were trying to do, the tightrope they were trying to walk, was keeping together the constituency that essentially voted for the withdrawal agreement, the last meaningful vote, which wasn't really even a meaningful vote. But anyway, on March the 29th, you basically got the biggest majority towards the deal that had happened, but it still didn't pass. They were hoping to hold that together and add in some Labour votes, or maybe get to Labour to the position where they might abstain. That was their gambit. The problem was, of course, that exactly as Pippa said, as soon as she even stood up, before she'd sat down, Conservative MPs who'd previously backed the deal started declaring against it. And that is because people are positioning themselves, understandably, for what comes next. And they recognise that there's going to be a future leadership competition, and they want to make sure that they've sorted their positions on that. From the Prime Minister's point of view, I think she's somebody who takes her duty very seriously, blah, blah, blah. But what she was wanting was to actually get this bit of Brexit done so that the next leader of the party could come in and actually inherit a process that was further advanced. Now, that didn't work at all. And I think the parliamentary opposition is now so great that it would be a huge mistake to introduce the bill. I don't think the bill should even be published.
It won't be covered. It will be withdrawn, won't it?
The thing is, to go back to your numbers thing, from the other side, the biggest numbers were for Kyle Wilson and Cooper, and it did look like...
These were the amendments that said you can have your bill, but only if there's a referendum.
Only if there's a confirmatory vote.
But those still got fewer than the deal.
But it did look like they would lend each other their support for a short time. I thought it was an absolute shoo-in, that they would just borrow, 15 votes from each other.
But sorry, let me just ask you this about Labour, because Henry mentioned this idea that the fatal flaw was it said, let me put myself... Theresa May, I put myself in the hands of Labour, you've got to do it. There was that moment where Barry Gardner famously said, we're trying to bail you out.
Yeah.
So Labour
Labour
are never going to do that, are they? They're never going to actually say, here's a Prime Minister on the ropes, we're going to be the ones to give her a hand and pick her up.
It's an absolutely bizarre situation they found themselves in. I disagree, actually, that Keir and John McDonnell are on separate sides, because I think, is that what you meant, that you thought that John McDonnell was in favour of a deal?
Yes.
Okay, so I don't think that's right. I think McDonnell and Keir are very much aligned, and they do both want a confirmatory vote at this point. The problem is you do have this kind of Lexit hardcore, which is now Trickett, Nandy, Lavery, and God.
And the leader's office.
And the leader's office. And it's getting to the point, it's getting really splenetic, because it's getting to the point where it doesn't matter. It's almost like a mini Brexit that they're having within the party, because it doesn't matter who argues what. The rest of the party, who are kind of pro-Remain, are finding it so kind of anti-democratic that they could make the best Lexit argument you've ever heard, or they could make they could come back with a deal that was unbelievably good, and the Remainers of the party still wouldn't swallow it, because they say you're really going against what all your MPs, all your members, and all your voters want.
And on those Labour elected here, the Downing Street overestimated how likely they were to come and support them from the off. And I don't think they were ever really going to. The
Labour leavers or the leaders?
Yeah, the Labour leavers. And I think there's been very striking moments at each of the votes so far that they've basically stood and watched to see who else has voted first, which lobbies they've gone into before making the decision which way they were going to go. There's no point expending them expending the political capital unless they were actually going to get the deal through.
Let's just move on to the news that did happen overnight, which was the resignation of a cabinet minister, Andrea Leadsom, and the expectation perhaps that would trigger some kind of domino and actually get Theresa May out. So how significant, first of all, Henry, is it that Andrea Leadsom has gone? And just play out for us, as you see it, the last days of Theresa May, if these are the last days of Theresa May.
I think these are the last days of Theresa May. I think it's difficult to make predictions up this close, but I think that it is a very big loss to lose Andrea Leadsom, because she's somebody who'd stuck with the Prime Minister despite obviously very big reservations about the overall direction of Brexit. And actually it was quite clear that there was a lot of affection between the two women who'd been the challengers for the Conservative leadership back in 2016. So I think this is a big moment for the Prime Minister, and it really does just mark, I think we're quite firmly into the end game now. We also know that
when does it come? Just very practically, we're now into the granular thing. Is it Friday after they've been voted? Is it Sunday?
It's a very hard guess. I think it would be sort of ironic if the Prime Minister tried to resign today and the broadcasters couldn't really cover it because of election rules. But so I think it means it's not going to happen till tomorrow.
Stranger things have happened.
I think what is probably likely to happen is that we know that the 1922 committee, the committee that controls a lot of the mechanics of the Conservative Party,
so-called backbench 1922,
exactly, and particularly the leadership process, they have essentially put into sealed envelopes their decisions on changing rules. And this is essentially the Prime Minister knows that the rules will be changed if she doesn't set out when she's going to resign. I don't think this necessarily means that she will resign on Friday or even on Monday. I think she's more likely to resign when Parliament returns, but to say a specific date when she will resign, and then she will stand outside Downing Street with a podium probably and make one of those speeches we've become so used to hearing, and that will be.
Will it be nothing has changed? Do you think?
I think at that point
everything
will have changed, and I think then obviously the Conservative leadership process will begin. Nominations will open and close. We'll have rounds of parliamentary voting. And that there'll be those two stages of the campaign again, the MPs phase first, and then the phase which goes to the national membership if that happens.
And so you'll be watching from the sidelines, enjoying it, will you? Or
I'm not going to enjoy this at all, because I always thought that the line from Conservatives was always the members would vote for Boris, but the MPs won't let him away. They just won't let him onto the slate because he's just not reliable. He's not plausible. He's not honest. But that seems to have changed, and all the Tories I know now say they will let him on because they're frightened. They're frightened of obliteration. So I'm really worried, it's not even that I don't share his politics. I just think the idea of being governed, even for a short time, by such a clown would be such a national shame.
Pippa, it does seem as if there's almost not quite a consensus, but an acceptance in Westminster, even as, like Zoe is saying, people who don't like him, that it's sort of inevitable that it's going to be Boris Johnson.
That has changed in the past few weeks, and it is primarily because Boris is probably one of the few of the Conservative leadership candidates that could neutralise Nigel Farage on the Brexit side, but could also take on Jeremy Corbyn on the Labour side. And even though he's a much more divisive figure than he once was because of his positioning on Brexit, he still has incredible cut-through in the country and is one, he's like a showbiz politician, isn't he? And for me, there was, in the last, even this week, there's been a significant shift. The two things that really made me think, actually, he's going to do it were the One Nation group of Conservatives met the other night, and having initially been seen as the Stop Boris group amongst the MPs, they started saying things like, well, if he drops his commitment to going for a no deal Brexit, if he reverts to his his previous socially liberal credentials, then maybe we could see that we could support him. So they're considering him rather than stopping him. And the other one was Ruth Davidson, the Scots Tory leader, who has been incredibly rude about Boris in the past and really, I think, personally isn't a big fan, suggesting that she might actually, after all, be prepared to work for him. Now, people like the One Nation Tories and Ruth Davidson see that for their own survival, the party's survival, to continue, to keep their seats in Parliament, they need Boris Johnson, and I think they'll back him.
If this is the mood, Henry, is it possible there won't even be a contest? We've seen it with Theresa May herself, with Michael Howard, that the Conservatives can sometimes just close in.
There was a contest with Theresa May, but it didn't go the full way.
Didn't go the full way. Yeah,
I think it depends what you think this leadership election is actually about. And that's quite an important question that the Conservatives haven't yet answered. Is this about the person that you need to win a short-term election? In which case, I think a lot of MPs may think that we need Boris to stand up against Nigel Farage. I can understand the attractions of Boris in many ways in those respects, but I think that you have to think whether actually it's plausible for the Conservatives to win a general election having not delivered Brexit against Nigel Farage. I don't think you could put up anybody and actually guarantee winning. If you look at the way that the opinion polls are, it doesn't point to that sort of picture at all for Westminster elections. Or are these elections actually about who do you want to bring the party together and bring the country together, handle the most complex negotiations we've ever had in peacetime, build a team and across government and so on? That's a very different question. I don't think the Conservative
What would be the answer if that was the question?
Well, I think that'll be the one that MPs will have to reach.
But you would think Michael Gove, but he's not even in the races, is he? In this one?
No, is he
going to go for it?
But the members are so against him. I mean, I saw the recent polling was something like 4% for Gove.
I think I think he could quite easily get the last two, though.
Really?
So it would be two levers against each other. Boris versus Michael Gove.
He's more MPs supporting him than, it's been for a long time, quietly under the radar, getting on, convincing.
I don't think members are as against him as you just said. Sorry, I think the key question is ultimately what is the question we're trying to answer here?
Yeah.
And I think there are lots of different candidates. One of the things is going to happen with this race is last time we had 5 candidates. This time we may well have over a dozen candidates all competing. It'd be absolutely extraordinary.
So Zoe, I'm partly looking to you because I think you might affirm my own prejudices on this, which is that people talk, and we heard Pippa and Henry say it, as if Boris Johnson's got these magic vote-winning powers and is electorally, has this chemistry with the electorate. I'm not sure I buy that. They were proceeding on a false premise here that he's some kind of magical vote winner.
I was thinking exactly that, so I am going to affirm your prejudices. I think your point is really true, that he has changed and he has changed his kind of political identity.
You're looking at Pippa as you say that, yeah.
I'm looking at everybody, by the way, listener. Everybody's true. He's really changed, and people think he's absolute magic at the ballot box because he won the mayoral election twice. And I do remember the first time he won, seeing him in Flitwick when he was launching his bus. There were kind of teenagers coming up to him, kind of mobbing him in a friendly way. And I thought, this is a different kind of popularity. But I don't think he does still have that. I think there are a lot of people who absolutely despise him, which isn't true before. We were very small in number, the people who despised him previously. Now I think the kind of shambles, the perception of disloyalty and treachery, the perception of incompetence, it has caught up with him. And I'd be very surprised if he was the catnip that his colleagues think he is.
Pippa, do you want to make it not a defence of Boris Johnson, but for his electoral appeal?
He's absolutely much more divisive than he was, of course. I just think that there are a lot of people that don't follow politics very closely, but who do vote. And I think sort of the showbiz appeal will still resonate. He still has cut through with a lot of people in the country who would potentially be making a choice between him and Jeremy Corbyn. Now, I happen to think that Jeremy Corbyn would win that contest, but Boris Johnson is somebody that the Labour Party fear more as a opponent than, for example, Dominic Raab or Esther McVeigh.
Yeah.
Different Labour MPs have different positions on this, but I think Boris Johnson is something of a Hillary Clinton of the coming leadership campaign in that everybody in the country has an opinion about him. And that's not necessarily true about lots of the other candidates who, to some degree, are completely unknown. So I think that's one of the interesting things here is that people have a fixed idea of Boris, maybe positive, maybe negative, and there's lots of sort of extremes on that, but he is known and he has that sort of public magnetic charisma that very few other politicians do.
All right, Zoe's slightly shaking her head at magnetic charisma, but thank you all. Earlier this week, it was announced that emergency funding talks between the government and British Steel had failed, and the company had entered insolvency, threatening thousands of jobs. Theresa May told Parliament the Treasury had agreed an indemnity to enable British Steel to continue to operate in the immediate future. Those are her words. But the size of the indemnity is unknown, so what lies ahead? I'm joined by The Guardian's Rob Davis from the business desk to discuss. Rob, just first of all, the background to this story.
So British Steel, which largely consists of the Scunthorpe Steelworks, has been in financial difficulty for some time. The steel industry globally isn't doing all that well. There were signs earlier this month that British Steel might need some sort of bailout, and it has asked the government for that. It's been turned down, and it's gone into insolvency.
And steel, some of us are old enough to remember when it was just a massive industry in this country.
The British Steel Corporation.
The British Steel Corporation, steel workers were just a huge part of the union movement. How important is steel now?
Well, I mean, steel to a sort of developed economy that likes to see itself as one of the major players on the world stage is extremely important. For a start, it's very important to defence. Pretty much everything we make for defence uses some kind of steel. Ships, aeroplanes, tanks, guns, you name it. So from that point of view, it's extremely important. It's also very important to industries such as construction. Network Rail buys 97% of its steel from British Steel. It could switch that to other suppliers, but the likelihood is that that would incur increased costs likely to be passed on to the likes of you and me. And if you want to make steel from scratch, you need a blast furnace. And we have 2 blast furnaces in this country. One is at Scunthorpe and the other is at Port Talbot. And if we lose Scunthorpe, we've got 1 left, and that's quite a precarious position to be in.
And that's capacity that once you lose it, you don't really get it back.
You don't get that back.
And how many people are involved in the industry, workers?
It's about 30-odd thousand at the moment. Now, you compare that to 1971 when it was more like 300,000. It's come down a long way. And one of the important things to remember about these jobs is that they are high-skilled and high-earning, and they're in areas where jobs like that are usually in short supply.
And you often, whenever there is an industrial story of any kind since 2016, people immediately say, or want to say, because of Brexit, or despite Brexit, if it's good news, from one side of the argument. What's the connection between this and Brexit, if any?
Well, the company itself has said that Brexit is a big factor. Now, sometimes companies like to use Brexit as an excuse. There are other factors at play here. First of all, raw material costs have gone up. Things like iron ore, which the steel industry uses a lot of. There's also kind of relatively weak demand for steel around the world at the moment. But there are some Brexit factors. First of all, the weakness of sterling. Now, Greybull, the company which owns British Steel, bought it after the referendum. So it bought it already after the point at which sterling had declined against the dollar. But that has persisted for longer than they would have liked. One of the key points is the uncertainty around the future of our trading relationship with Europe. Steel customers tend to buy their products a long time in advance. It could be 9 months, even a year. So they would be making orders now for delivery after the October 31st date at which we assume possibly the Brexit might happen. So they're now looking at that and thinking, well, we don't know whether tariff is going to be applied to these products. The cost of them might go up. We're going to turn to other suppliers, whether that's in the EU or elsewhere. So according to the company, those orders have dried up. That leaves them with a bit of a cash crunch. That's one of the reasons why they wanted some money from the government.
So unlike some cases, it's actually plausible to see a Brexit connection here because it's right in that field where imports, tariffs, all of that stuff applies.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think it's worth mentioning at this point that some people have said, were Britain to be outside the EU, we might be able to give some sort of state aid that EU rules currently prohibit us from giving. I'm not entirely convinced by that argument. For a start, the World Trade Organization already places restrictions on state aid. Secondly, other countries in the European Union already give plenty of state aid, far more than we do.
Anyone who's travelled on French railways or German railways knows that.
Precisely.
I mean, putting aside the case of British Steel, is there a Brexit effect on the economy, inhibiting investment or helping investment?
Well, I mean, you only have to look at the comments that have been made by various large employers in the UK, so Airbus, a number of automotive companies that are extremely worried about Brexit. I mean, the biggest problem really is the uncertainty about how it's going to look. I think most businesses feel that if they know what the future holds, they can prepare for that and they can take remedial action. Very few businesses think that Brexit in itself is a good idea, but there are some out there, but very few think that. But most would just like to know what the situation is going to be. I think no deal is the disaster that you'll hear the aerospace industry, the automotive sector, the financial services sector, talk in very grave terms about. Some sort of deal, the impression I get, most businesses feel they could live with. They just want to know what it is.
That's what you always hear, isn't it? We can cope with rain, we can cope with sunshine, we just can't cope with not knowing.
Precisely.
And because it's Brexit, I mean, it's obviously related. Is there something government could have done, should have done, might do with this episode?
I mean, at the moment, they're just trying to find a buyer for this site, which could be difficult. There are a few things that the steel industry has been asking for a while. Certainly, there is some headroom to do more government procurement from British businesses within the rules that exist. The steel industry uses a lot of energy. It's very energy-intensive business, so they would like to see some sort of help on energy costs. Business rates are another thing that disproportionately hit the steel industry quite hard. So if there was some relief on that front, that would help. The government has said, in terms of just injecting cash, it believes that to be unlawful under state aid rules. So it seems like that's a non-starter.
So it's other forms of help. We should avoid political predictions on this podcast, but this is different. It's industry. So what's your prediction of what might happen with British Steel?
Look, I don't want to alarm anybody who works at British Steel. It's hard to see who would want to come in and buy this business, given how it has struggled under successive owners. There are some companies out there that have been buying steel operations in the UK. There's a company called Liberty House that could be a potential buyer. There are other players on the world stage that could be. And in fact, Greg Clark, the business minister, said in the House yesterday there had been some early expressions of interest. So I think we have to hold out hope for a white knight buyer. Without that, it's hard to see how that plant continues to function.
Rob Davies, thank you.
Thank you very much.
We'll be back after the break to discuss the European elections.
Today in Focus is a new Guardian podcast that brings you closer to our journalism by getting behind the news every weekday. You'll join me, Anushka Astana, talking to people at the centre of the big stories impacting our world. We'll use personal perspectives and expert analysis to put you at the heart of what matters. Listen to Today in Focus and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you choose to listen.
Welcome back. Today, voting is taking place, in case you hadn't noticed, for the European elections, the elections that were never meant to happen. The Brexit Party and the Lib Dems are both expected to do well, according to the opinion polls, and the Conservatives are expected to suffer an absolute drubbing, if you believe the polls. We won't know the actual results until late Sunday or even Monday. So today we're just going to look back at the campaigns fought by the parties, still with our panel Pippa Carrera, Henry Newman, and The Guardian's own Zoe Williams. Zoe, let's just begin with you. Who do you think's made the biggest dent, just in terms of fighting a good campaign?
Oh my goodness, this is a really hard question because the campaigns have been terrible across the piece. Obviously, Brexit Party has fought a really smart campaign. The Labour Party, the individual campaigns have been incredible, but the leadership has made such a horrible mess of an overall party campaign that from a distance, you can't tell. So, Laura Parker in London, Eloise Todd in Yorkshire, they've run amazing campaigns, actually. If they were Labour candidates in an election, they'd be,
in a Westminster election.
Election, they'd be completely fine. So that's been quite good. The Greens have done quite well, I think. Lib Dems are touting what they think is a really clear message, but what it's failed, just as Labour's problem is that it's got an opinion on everything except Brexit. The Lib Dems' problem is that it only has an opinion on Brexit. And that, given that their unpopularity is based on the fact that you never know which way they're going to jump, that I don't think will play that well for them. So the only people, I think Labour and Conservative have run the worst campaigns.
Well, I did some reporting myself on the Conservative campaign, and there wasn't a campaign.
That's exactly that. I think
it didn't exist. I mean, I scoured the country trying to find it.
There
There weren't
no
even
launch. We were told at the beginning of it all that the Prime Minister would certainly be involved and be out campaigning. But have you seen her anywhere?
But what was that photograph where everybody looked really depressed?
In Bristol. She did an event which wasn't an event. It's an amazing, it's almost like some sort of meta thing, where she went into a holding room at Ashton Gate, the football ground for Bristol City, and it was her, 2 TV cameras, 2 still photographers, a single reporter, and the 4 candidates for the South West, and no members of the public. That was the room. And the one reporter was allowed to ask one question. She read a prepared statement to the camera, and then it was out. It was literally
that a book
a
by the
non-event.
American philosopher, the Image. But
Yes.
So the Conservatives didn't really have a campaign. There was one video I saw coming up on Twitter. It was actually quite well put together. I think the absolute worst campaign has got to go to Change UK. Because this is a party that was specific.
That says it all, doesn't it?
It does.
I mean, I think Change UK was a party founded to supposedly hoover up the millions of people who've been left politically homeless because of Brexit. And they're polling on around 5% or less. It's absolutely extraordinary. And some of that is the infighting amongst the leaders. I was reading just this morning that there was a fight between the 3 former Conservative MPs. Heidi Allen, I can't remember exactly her title, but interim leader, threatened to resign when she was opposed by Anna Soubry. She also then said that the party may not even exist by the time of the next general election. So just absolute chaos. But I think the bigger thing it points to is the entire narrative we've heard for the last 3 years was that the country had changed its mind and wanted to stop Brexit. And instead, what we're seeing is the only new party that's doing very, very well is the Brexit Party, which is polling nearly at 40% of the votes. Absolutely extraordinary. And to my mind, really quite concerning. If you add together the vote share for the Brexit Party, UKIP, there was a rump of the old Nigel Farage Party, and the Conservatives, you get to pretty much 50%. When you add in Labour, which at best is facing both ways on Brexit, you've got a very clear majority not wanting Brexit stopped. Now, you can say that a second referendum might come up with a different result, perfectly legitimate argument. But I think it's impossible to say that a second referendum could be clearly one for Remain. And this is being noticed across on the continent. Just a quick point. Macron's former Europe minister, Nathalie Loiseau, lead candidate for Macron's party, La République En Marche, in these European elections, said just yesterday that Britain having a second referendum would not lead to a different result, and the best thing now is Britain just to leave. I think that's a sense that's going to grow more and more and more on the continent, and that's the single most important thing about these European elections.
I don't think the French En Marche representative is actually representative of what Europe thinks of the progressive side in Europe. Most people are noting that 58% of people are now Remain when you ask them. So, we can endlessly
Henry's
interpret.
point is if you add up
if
the
you
numbers,
add Labour, but I think...
No, even without adding Labour,
without Labour.
It's not getting to 58% for
It's
the
not,
Remain.
it's not, but
But we don't know till we've had the numbers. Pippa, just the story of the Brexit Party is a bit of a phenomenon because it didn't exist a few months ago, and whatever the exact numbers, it has made a huge surge from nowhere. You take Zoe's point about, is it just really UKIP rebadged? But it has seemed from a distance to be putting sort of morality or rights and wrongs of it to one side, just in terms of political effectiveness, quite an effective operation.
Yeah, and it's also, it's happened at the same time that UKIP has declined as a political force, both in terms of its vote share and its sort of legitimacy, really. It's become a sort of a far-right extremist fringe party. And so it's attracted voters from who were previously UKIP and also from the Conservative Party. And I think for a party that, it's been really apparent to me, sort of watching Nigel Farage travel around the country, is that, they have no policies, there's no manifesto, he's got no answers to any questions. And yet he's got one simple, clear, cut-through message, which is that the Westminster elite, in his words, have betrayed the result of the referendum. And that's an incredibly powerful message when a lot of the country looks at Westminster and sees, quite rightly, chaos, infighting, indecision, ambiguity. To be able to stand there and say, I have a clear message, and to have the personality and force of Nigel Farage being the salesman, the spokesman for that, it's a pretty deadly combination.
Just on the Farage factor, again, absolutely putting to one side whether you think his message is right or wrong, just as a political communicator, is he now the most effective political communicator in the country, Henry?
Well, it's certainly very, very hard to dismiss. And I don't know whether he's the most effective.
I mean, who's more effective than him?
I don't think he's actually very good at debates or interviews in terms of getting a message, which is not exactly the same thing. But I think if you scrutinise him, what happened when he was on the Andrew Marr show now about 10 days ago? He had a tantrum on the basis, I thought, completely reasonable questioning about, for example, his relationship and views on Vladimir Putin and the Russian presidency. So I think at one level he's a very effective communicator because politics is about communicating a message overall. At another level, I think if you actually scrutinise what he's saying in debates, it's much harder for him. The problem is, of course, that new media, Twitter in particular, videos you can share on Facebook, allow you to communicate much, much more directly. Overall, I think what we're seeing in these European elections, ironically, is British politics becoming more European. Look what's happened in France and Italy. The mainstream parties there have been swept out the way in national elections. The PD on the left on Italy, Forza Italia on the right, have been replaced by Five Star Movement and the League, which has now become a national party. In France, the Socialists and the Republicans are gone, and these European elections are between the National Rally and Macron's new movement. The same thing is happening in some respects here in the UK. The irony of Brexit is actually making our politics more European. But I think it's very dangerous when you have mainstream political parties, which are in themselves bedrocks of democracy, swept aside and new movements coming through. So I'm very worried about what sort of effect this could have on the long term in our politics.
Just on that, Zoe, Farage, you made the point that in a way it's just UKIP, the same numbers as UKIP. But is there a worry in your mind that actually the Brexit party and Farage could be a force, not just in European elections, but in Westminster as a potential...
I certainly worry
even
about
for
this, but because I totally agree with Pippa that his message is Westminster is completely bent, don't trust them, and those kind of politics of distrust, they're very historically these are very familiar and very ugly and very destructive. You never get a movement growing out of that has some really great policy ideas for the future of the country. So I am worried about that. Nigel Farage's shtick is very much, and he's fashioned this for years, and I do have some admiration just for him sticking at it, is this victim outsider. So you can't ask him anything because he's always the victim and he's always the outsider. And it's very much, the Marr interview was really interesting because what he did, he kind of ad hominems himself. He forces people to play him, not the ball. And then he rolls around on the ground howling, going, "Ow, you hurt me, you hurt me." It's like a kind of Premier League football manoeuvre. And I still think people don't really buy it. I mean, I know I always say that.
Very brief, because I want to ask about the Electoral Commission.
I think you're right to a degree. I know quite a few people who are voting for the Brexit Party. And I think what's interesting about it is that all of them say, I don't like Nigel Farage, but I'm doing this to send a message. And they remember the comments he made about HIV-positive migrants back in the general election debates in 2015. I remember I was working at Conservative office at the time. Those debates were on television and everybody gasped. That was a sort of a serious was more than a dog whistle moment. Yeah. So I think that Zoe's exactly right, that there is this sort of sense that this is a little bit, people might be willing to hold their nose and do it to send a political sign. A general election, I think, is a quite different thing.
And just one attack, as he framed it, that came in his way this week was an investigation, Pippa, from the Electoral Commission. And it was an issue that had been highlighted by Gordon Brown, who said that the Brexit Party was able to take foreign and untraceable donations via PayPal. And Gordon Brown coined this line saying, he's not a man of the people, he's a man of the PayPal. Farage himself hit back, said, how dare he, talking about Brown. Most of our money has been raised by people giving £25 to become registered supporters. Frankly, this smacks of jealousy because the other parties simply can't do this. That was Farage's rebuttal. But what do you think of that twist in the campaign and how serious is it?
Well, I think it definitely plays into this image of Farage and the Brexit Party and more widely the Leave movement as having some questions to answer about their funding, which has been going on since the referendum and continues to go on. So it's not a good look for them, absolutely. Last week, a colleague, one of my team at the Mirror, did an investigation and basically went through the process of applying to become a member or a supporter of the different parties. Of course, the Brexit Party isn't actually a party. It's a business, but you can still you can sign up to become a supporter.
It's a business which Nigel Farage, owns.
Exactly. And my colleague Mikey decided that he was going to adopt the name of V. Putin and his address was the Kremlin, and went through the application process, and he established that you could apply to become a supporter of the Brexit Party without having to say where you were donating money from. Now, this obviously raises the possibility, unproven, but is nevertheless a possibility, that the Brexit Party could be accepting donations, small donations, because they're under a threshold.
Less than £500.
Less under £500. But if there's enough of them, though,
it all adds up
from abroad. And this, then Gordon Brown said that he obviously urged the Electoral Commission to investigate the
and then they did.
legality.
And they went into his offices.
In 2014, the European Electoral Commission investigated him for using EU funds to run his UKIP campaign. He's under investigation as we speak about using staff intended for his MEP role in his UK political role. So he's not, he's not known for his probity, and that's even before you take into account the kind of many strange manoeuvres he does whenever he's asked about, the £450,000, the flight ticket to Strasbourg. There have
been questions about his use of EU expenses. He, of course, has always denied any wrongdoing or any illegality. Henry, do you want to come in on this?
Yeah, look, I think obviously it's very important there's probity through the fundraising for political parties, and there are serious problems with this. I think overall political parties have a big problem because you've got to find a way of raising money for politics. That's a good thing, and we don't want to spend public money on that. So I think this is difficult, especially for new parties that are trying to come into that. But just one last thought. I do think that the important thing here is to focus on the arguments, and that there's a risk if everyone just jumps into, they're cheating the system, they're cheating the system, that we just reinforce the message of victimhood that Nigel Farage thrives on.
Let's just get to one last thing, because time is running out. We all have, some of us have those sort of little permanent cups for coffee. There are glasses all on the table. We are not dousing each other with any of these liquids. They are staying in their glasses, but... let's go around. What do we think of what our colleague Aditya Chakraborty called the milkshake spring? It's so far been Farage himself, Carl Benjamin from UKIP, so-called Tommy Robinson, have been on the receiving end of a milkshake thrown over their clothes. What do you think of that? Is it political theatre, or is it political violence, or is it something else? Zoe?
I agree with Aditya. I always agree with Aditya, and I agree that it's political theatre. What I've really found with this debate, and that's horrified me, is that there is a long history of throwing dairy products at one another. There is a long history of this being understood to be a playful gesture and not an act of violence. So
if John McDonnell and Jeremy Corbyn had been deluged with thing, you'd be saying playful, fine.
Corbyn had an egg thrown at him.
But I had a lot of people who are Corbyn supporters took that very seriously and said he needs protection and this is serious, this is no laughing matter.
But
and now it's political theatre. So I wonder if our view
Johnny,
changes depending on what
Johnny,
happens.
You're doing that thing where because there's somebody who might conceivably be on your side who said a thing, that's what everybody around Corbyn thinks. Most people think an egg, anything that isn't hard and doesn't hurt, is basically playful.
I've worked closely with MPs. I've got friends and MPs of all different parties and friends who are journalists. And I think that people who are in public life, obviously, if you're a broadcast journalist in particular, you're very recognisable. If you're an MP, in many cases, you're very recognisable. You don't want to lose that interaction. That's part of how our politics works. But equally, people are very angry, and that can be very terrifying. So on the other hand, I think we've got to put this in perspective. A milkshake or an egg is not political violence. And how do you draw that distinction? There was a quite interesting thing running on Twitter before with one of the guys who used to work in George Bush, the president's Secret Service detail, and was describing how even after 9/11, they would still have a whole plan for when the president got egged or whatever, which was based around changing a suit, getting back in the car, moving on. And I think that we got to keep this in perspective. Of course, there have been absolutely terrifying moments in recent politics where MPs have been on the receiving end of very serious violence. Journalists have been on the receiving end of death threats. So there are serious problems. On the other hand, you don't want to sanitize politics where only any elected official has to drive around in an armoured car. Where is that space in the middle? That's what we've got to get to.
I think there's a long history of people chucking eggs or throwing flour or now onto milkshakes or the equivalent.
Course, yeah.
And it's something which politicians have just had to put up with over time. What I think is different about now is that we're at a particularly febrile moment in politics where, as Henry says, politicians are receiving death threats. Not only that, Jo Cox was murdered. And it's changed things. It really has changed things. The number of MPs I speak to that are really worried about their own safety. Yeah. And I think because of that, we can't just dismiss it as a milkshake or an egg. It's not about the actual object. It's more about the if you seem to dismiss that, then it might seem to in some way condone any sort of physical action against a politician. And I think we're just in really difficult terrain and need to be extremely careful.
Thank you all very much. It's going to be another crazy week ahead of us, and buckle up. Well, that is all we have time for this week. My thanks to all our guests, Pippa Crerar, Henry Newman and Zoe Williams, and earlier Rob Davis. The producer was David O'Donnell. I'm Jonathan Friedland. Thanks for listening.
For more great podcasts from The Guardian, just go...